She wore her wedding dress with a smile, a vision in white against the stark gray backdrop of the 19th century New England coast. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sea, held a promise of devotion, of a shared life, of warmth against the biting ocean winds. But every man who stood beside her at the altar, every man who placed a ring upon her finger and called her his wife, would never live long enough to see a happy ending. Their vows were not prophecies of a future together, but countdowns to a solitary grave. This is the story of Alara Thorne, the woman they would come to call the Black Widow Bride. A tale whispered in hushed tones in taverns and sewing circles. A chilling legend of love, loss, and a revenge so cold it could freeze the very marrow in your bones. It's a story that asks a terrifying question. How many husbands must a woman bury before people start to wonder if she is cursed by misfortune, or if she is, in fact, the curse itself? Our story doesn't begin with a wedding, but with an arrival. The small salt-sprayed town of Havenwood, Maine, was a place where everyone knew everyone else's business. It was a community carved from granite and timber, where lives were dictated by the turning of the tides and the harshness of the seasons. Strangers were a novelty, a brief distraction from the rhythm of fishing nets and church bells. So when the afternoon stagecoach rattled to a stop in the town square in the spring of 1872, and a solitary woman dressed in modest but well-made traveling clothes stepped out, heads turned. She was not old, nor was she a giddy young girl. She was perhaps in her early 20s, with hair the color of polished jet pulled back in a severe bun, and a face that seemed to hold a profound stillness. She introduced herself to the postmaster as Miss Alara Thorne, a woman of some small means, seeking a quiet place to settle after the pass-in of her distant parents. Her story was simple, believable, and offered with a quiet dignity that discouraged prying questions. She rented a small cottage on the edge of town, one that overlooked the restless Atlantic, and for a time, she was simply a quiet, unassuming addition to the fabric of Havenwood. The women of the town, in their cautious way, tried to bring her into their fold. They would bring her fresh-baked bread or a jar of preserves, their visits a delicate dance of information gathering disguised as charity. They found a woman who was polite but reserved, graceful but distant. Her home was impeccably clean. Her hands were never idle. She was a fine seamstress, and her voice was soft and low. But there was a wall around her, an invisible barrier of sorrow, they presumed, that no one could quite breach. The men of the town saw something else. They saw a haunting beauty, a mystery that was both alluring and unsettling. In a town of plain, hard-working folk, Alara Thorne was like a rare dark orchid discovered in a field of daisies. They would tip their hats a little deeper, their gazes lingering a moment too long. She would offer a small, polite nod in return, her eyes never betraying a flicker of interest. She was a puzzle, and Havenwood, for all its simple ways, loved a good puzzle. What they couldn't know, what no one could possibly have guessed, was that Alara was not running from a past filled with grief. She was methodically, patiently, hunting a future filled with vengeance. To understand the woman Alara Thorne became, we must travel back a decade and 100 miles south, to a bustling port city where she was not Alara Thorne at all, but Alara Vance, the cherished only child of a master shipwright. Her father, a man with hands as skilled as any artist, could shape wood into vessels that seemed to have a life of their own. Her childhood was filled with the scent of sawdust and sea salt, the symphony of hammers and saws, the comfort of a father whose love was as steady and strong as the oaken hulls he built. They were not wealthy, but they were respected and happy. Her father had a dream, to build his own shipyard, to be his own master, to pass a legacy down to his daughter. He poured every penny he had, every ounce of his energy, into this dream, taking on a powerful local merchant, a man named Silas Croft, as a silent partner. Croft was a man whose wealth was as vast as his conscience was small. He dripped with false charm, promising her father the world while meticulously drafting contracts that were little more than elegant traps. The betrayal, when it came, was as swift and brutal as a winter squall. A series of conveniently timed supply disruptions, a mysterious fire in the lumberyard, and a sudden calling in of debts, all orchestrated by Croft, left her father financially ruined. The half-finished ships, his life's work, were seized. The family home was taken. They were cast out onto the street with nothing but the clothes on their backs. The shame and despair broke her father. He, a man who had built marvels with his bare hands, could no longer find the will to even lift a hammer. He wasted away, his powerful frame shrinking, his bright eyes growing dull, until he was taken by a fever that his weakened body could not fight. Ilara, then just a girl of 15, watched her hero die, not from sickness, but from a broken heart. Her mother, lost in a fog of grief, followed him less than a year later. Ilara was left utterly alone, a ghost in a world that had once been her kingdom. She stood at her parents' unmarked graves in a potter's field and made a vow. It was not a vow of tears or sorrow. It was a vow of ice and fire. Silas Croft and the men like him who built their empires on the ruins of good people would pay. She would not reclaim her father's money or his name. She would take everything from them, just as they had taken everything from her. She would dismantle their lives from the inside out, using the very tools society afforded her: her beauty, her grace, and the perceived vulnerability of her gender. She would become a bride, over and over again. She vanished from the city, changing her name, erasing the girl she had been. She spent years working as a governess, a lady's companion, observing the wealthy, learning their ways, their etiquette, their weaknesses. She learned about finance, about wills and testaments, about the subtle poisons that grew in gardens, the ones that mimicked the symptoms of common illnesses. She hardened herself, chipping away at the soft-hearted girl she used to be, until only a diamond-hard core of purpose remained. When she finally arrived in Havenwood, she was no longer a victim. She was a weapon, honed and patient, waiting for its moment. And that moment arrived in the form of her first husband, Mr. Thomas Miller. Thomas was a good man. That was his defining characteristic. And in Ilara's grand cold calculus, it was also his fatal flaw. He was a farmer, a widower some 20 years her senior, with a prosperous farm just inland from the town. He was lonely, kind-hearted, and utterly captivated by the quiet, melancholy beauty of the newcomer, Miss Thorne. He wasn't part of her grand revenge plot against Silas Croft and his associates. He was merely a necessary first step. He was a means to an end. He had what she needed: a respectable name, a solid standing in the community, and, most importantly, assets that could be liquidated to fund the next, more significant phase of her plan. If you're watching this from a place where lives are insured and documented down to the last detail, you have to transport yourself back to a time when things were much simpler. A time when a man's word was his bond, and a sudden illness was simply God's will. Their courtship was a model of propriety. He would call on her at her small cottage, bringing her flowers from his wife's old garden or a basket of fresh eggs. She would welcome him with a shy smile, serving him tea and listening with rapt attention as he spoke of his crops, his livestock, the predictable, comforting rhythm of his life. The town watched and approved. It seemed a perfect match, the lonely farmer and the grieving seamstress, finding solace in one another. "He's giving her a home," one woman might have said to another over a shared clothesline, "and she's bringing that sad house back to life." What would you have thought if you lived in Havenwood then? Would you have seen a budding romance, a second chance at happiness for two lonely souls? Or would some small primal part of your brain have whispered a warning, a sense of profound wrongness you couldn't quite name? Thomas Miller certainly saw nothing wrong. He saw an angel. He saw a woman whose gentle presence soothed the ache of his loneliness. He proposed one evening as the sun set over the ocean, the sky painted in hues of orange and purple. Ilara accepted with a quiet grace, a single tear rolling down her cheek. Thomas took it as a tear of joy. He could never have comprehended that it was a tear of mourning for the part of herself she had to kill to perform this role, a final fleeting farewell to the innocent girl she once was. They were married 3 months after she first arrived in town. The ceremony was small, held in the town's simple white-steepled church. She wore a modest second-hand wedding dress that she had meticulously altered herself. She looked, by all accounts, radiant. As she stood beside Thomas, her small hand in his large weathered one, she looked every bit the blushing bride. He saw a future of companionship, of shared sunrises and quiet evenings. She saw a ledger, an asset to be acquired and then liquidated. His life was the price of her entry into the game. Life on the Miller farm was, for a time, idyllic. Elara proved to be a capable and diligent wife. The farmhouse, which had fallen into a state of benign neglect after the first Mrs. Miller's passing, was soon sparkling. Meals were on time, his clothes were always mended, and there was an order and peace that had been absent for years. Thomas was deliriously happy. He would tell his friends at the general store how fortunate he was, how Miss Thorne, Mrs. Miller now, had been a gift from heaven. He had no idea he was living with a ghost, a woman whose heart was 1,000 miles away, buried in a pauper's grave. Elara played her part to perfection. She was attentive, she was kind, but she was never truly present. While he saw a life being built, she was simply waiting for the right time to begin the demolition. The end for Thomas Miller came just 6 months after their wedding day, on a crisp autumn afternoon. The official story, the one the town doctor and the sheriff accepted without question, was that it was a tragic accident. Thomas had been repairing a section of the barn roof that had been damaged in a recent storm. It was presumed he lost his footing. Perhaps a loose shingle gave way, and he fell. He landed headfirst on the hard-packed earth and the stone foundation below. Elara was the one who found him. Her screams, they said, were chilling, echoing across the fields and drawing neighbors from their homes. They found her cradling his broken body, her dress stained with his blood, her face a mask of unimaginable horror and grief. She was inconsolable. The performance was flawless. The town of Havenwood wrapped its collective arms around the poor, twice-grieving widow. First her parents, now her loving husband. "The woman is just cursed with loss," was the prevailing sentiment. They brought her food. They sat with her in the now silent farmhouse. They offered their condolences and their help. No one thought to ask why Thomas, a man who had been scrambling over barn roofs his entire life, a man known for his sure-footedness, would have fallen on such a clear, calm day. No one thought to inspect the rungs of the ladder he had used, to see if they might have been slicked with something, a bit of grease or oil that wouldn't be out of place in a barn, but would be treacherous on a ladder. No one questioned why the family dog, who was always at Thomas's side, had been locked in the cellar that afternoon, its frantic barking unheard until after the discovery. These were not questions one asked of a grieving widow. They were thoughts too dark, too cruel to contemplate. Elara wore black, the color of a widow's weeds. But for her, it was not a symbol of her loss. It was the color of her patience, the color of the long night she had endured, and the darkness she was now ready to wield as a weapon. She inherited the farm and all of Thomas Miller's savings, as was her right as his wife. To the town's admiration, she did not try to run the farm herself. She announced with profound sadness that the memories were too painful for her to remain. She sold the farm, the livestock, and the equipment to a neighboring family for a fair price. She was now a woman of independent means, not wealthy, not by the standards of Silas Croft and his ilk, but secure. She had the capital she needed. Her first performance was over, and in the quiet of her rented room at the town inn, away from the prying, sympathetic eyes of Havenwood, she took out a map and a list of names. The name of Thomas Miller was not on it. He had been the prologue. Now, with his legacy funding her journey, she was ready to begin the first chapter of her real story. Her revenge was just beginning. This is the kind of story that gets lost to time, buried under layers of official records and polite fictions. The stories of quiet, dangerous women are often the ones history chooses to forget. If you want to make sure more of these forgotten tales are brought into the light, take a moment to subscribe to this channel. It helps ensure these voices, no matter how chilling, are not silenced by the passage of time. Elara Thorne, now the respectable and tragic widow Mrs. Miller, did not linger in Havenwood. She left as quietly as she had arrived, a wraith passing through their lives. Her destination was a bustling industrial city in Massachusetts, a place teeming with new money, new factories, and men whose ambition far outstripped their morality. It was the perfect hunting ground. Here, she was not the talk of a small town. She was anonymous, a face in the crowd, and that was exactly how she wanted it. She took up residence in a respectable boarding house, presenting herself as a widow looking to make a new life, perhaps as a companion or a governess. Her quiet demeanor and the subtle elegance of her mourning clothes spoke of good breeding and tragic circumstances, making her an object of sympathy and intrigue. She moved with a silent, deliberate purpose, her eyes always scanning, always watching. She was searching for her next husband, her next victim. But this time, it wouldn't be a simple farmer. This time, it would be a man connected to her past. A man who knew Silas Croft. His name was Arthur Finch. He was a junior partner in a textile import company, a man whose success was built on sharp practices and a network of powerful, unscrupulous men, Silas Croft among them. Finch was everything Thomas Miller was not: arrogant, flashy, with a cruel streak he reserved for those he deemed beneath him. He was also ambitious and deeply insecure, desperate to be seen as a man of culture and refinement. Elara observed him from a distance for weeks. She learned his routines: the chop house where he took his lunch, the park where he walked on Sunday afternoons, the social club he frequented. She engineered their first meeting with the precision of a master strategist. A dropped handkerchief, a damsel in distress, a gentleman coming to her aid. It was a scene as old as time, but Elara played it with a vulnerability that disarmed him completely. He was immediately smitten. Here was a woman of obvious class and beauty, wrapped in an aura of tragic romance. Owning her would be a status symbol, like a fine watch or a prize-winning horse. He saw her as an acquisition that would elevate his standing in society. He courted her with an aggressive proprietary zeal, showering her with gifts she accepted with a demure and hesitant gratitude. He spoke at length about his business, his successes, his connections, boasting of deals and conquests. Elara listened patiently, her mind a cold, clear vault, filing away every name, every detail, every casual admission of corruption. She would occasionally mention her late, dear husband, the simple farmer, and Finch would dismiss him with a condescending wave. "A man of the soil," he'd say. "Honest work, I'm sure, but not for a woman of your delicacy. You deserve the finer things, my dear Elara." He had no idea that the man of the soil had paid for the very dress she was wearing, that his life was the currency that had brought her to Finch's doorstep. They were married within 4 months. It was a much grander affair than her first wedding. Arthur Finch wanted to show off his beautiful new bride. Elara stood at the altar, a vision in gray silk, her expression one of serene submission. She looked at this man, a cog in the machine that had destroyed her family, and felt nothing. No hatred, no anger, just a profound and chilling emptiness. The part of her that could feel such things was long dead. He was a problem to be solved, a chapter to be written and then closed. After the wedding, she entered his world, a world of lavish dinner parties, business associates with predatory smiles, and wives who dripped with jewels and unspoken miseries. She was the perfect hostess, charming and graceful, her quiet nature seen as a sign of elegant restraint. The men were charmed by her beauty. Their wives were wary of it. They would whisper behind their fans, "Where did he find her? She's so quiet. Do you think she's simple?" They couldn't have been more wrong. Elara wasn't simple. she was focused. While they gossiped, she was mapping the intricate web of deceit and greed that connected these men. Arthur Finch was a man of particular appetites and habits. He prided himself on his robust health, starting each day with a vigorous walk and ending it with a glass of expensive brandy. He was also, as Alara quickly learned, a man who suffered from terrible indigestion, a fact he complained about constantly. He kept a bottle of bicarbonate of soda by his bedside, a common remedy for an overindulgent stomach. It was a small domestic detail, the kind of thing a wife would know. It was also the kind of detail a killer could exploit. Arsenic, in small, carefully administered doses, is a ghost. It mimics the symptoms of acute gastric distress. It is tasteless, odorless, and in an era before sophisticated forensic science, virtually undetectable. A man with a chronically upset stomach who suddenly takes a turn for the worse? It was unfortunate, but hardly suspicious. Alara began her work slowly, patiently. A minuscule amount of the white powder, purchased from a chemist for the stated purpose of rat control in their large house, was added to his nightly brandy. At first, he complained of severe stomach cramps. Alara was the doting wife, fetching him hot water bottles, brewing him soothing teas, her brow furrowed with concern. She would sit by his bedside, reading to him in her low, calm voice as the poison did its insidious work. He grew weaker, his arrogant bluster replaced by the whining of a man in constant discomfort. The doctor was called. He diagnosed it as a severe case of gastritis, exacerbated by Finch's rich diet and love of spirits. He must simplify his diet, the doctor instructed Alara, who nodded with grave understanding. I shall do my best, doctor, but he is a man of strong habits. The doses continued, never enough to be immediately fatal, but enough to systematically break down his body. He became gaunt, his skin taking on a pale, waxy sheen. His blustering confidence evaporated, replaced by a terrified dependence on his ever-present, ever-caring wife. His business partners would visit, looking at him with a mixture of pity and impatience. Their world had no place for the weak. Alara would greet them at the door, her eyes red-rimmed from what they assumed were sleepless nights of worry. She would give them hushed updates on his condition, her voice trembling slightly. They saw a saint. He saw a lifeline. But he was holding on to an anchor. The end came on a rainy Tuesday night, 8 months into their marriage. A slightly larger dose, enough to push his ravaged system over the edge. He died in agony, clutching his stomach, his last moments filled with the terror that Alara watched with the dispassionate calm of a scientist observing an experiment. She held his hand until the last breath rattled in his chest. Then she let it drop, went to the mirror, and tidied a stray strand of her hair before composing her face into a mask of grief and screaming for the servants. The doctor's verdict was swift and certain. Acute gastroenteritis, a tragic but not unexpected end for a man with his known stomach troubles. Arthur Finch, a man who had cheated and bullied his way to the top, was dead. And his beautiful, heartbroken widow was now a very wealthy woman. She inherited his shares in the company, his grand house, his entire fortune. This time, the grief she projected was different. It was not the raw shock she had displayed for Thomas Miller. It was a more refined, dignified sorrow, fitting for a woman of her new station. She saw no one for weeks, the house shrouded in black crepe. When she finally emerged, she was a figure of tragic nobility. She met with Arthur's business partners, men who were now, technically, her business partners. They expected a flighty, emotional woman they could easily cheat out of her inheritance. They were not prepared for the woman who met them in the study. Dressed in elegant black, her face pale but her eyes sharp and intelligent, she listened as they offered to buy her shares for a fraction of their worth. To save you the trouble of dealing with such complex matters, my dear Mrs. Finch. Alara let the silence hang in the air for a moment before she spoke. Her voice was soft, but it carried the weight of cold steel. She countered with a figure that was not only fair, but demonstrated a shocking and complete understanding of the company's finances and market value. She had, after all, spent months listening to her husband boast. The men were stunned into silence. They had come to swindle a widow. They found themselves facing a businesswoman. She liquidated her assets coolly and efficiently, turning Arthur Finch's ill-gotten gains into a formidable and portable fortune. She had now stripped a key player in Silas Croft's network of his life and his legacy, and she had done it without anyone suspecting a thing. She was a ghost in their machine, and she was just getting started. The name Arthur Finch was crossed off her list. 2 husbands down, 2 funerals. And for Ilara, it was 2 steps closer to the man who had started it all. Her quiet, methodical war of attrition was proving devastatingly effective. Her grief was a costume, her weddings were declarations of war, and her honeymoons were the calm before the storm. The Black Widow was weaving a web that was growing larger and more intricate, and her ultimate prey was getting ever closer. Her fortune was now considerable, a silent, deadly testament to her resolve. With the wealth of Arthur Finch converted into bank drafts and hidden assets, she was no longer a woman of small means. She was a predator who had successfully shed her skin, leaving behind the persona of the pitiable Mrs. Finch, just as she had shed the skin of the simple Mrs. Miller. Each identity was a tool, used and then discarded. Now she needed a new one, a new hunting ground. Her research, gleaned from Arthur's late-night brandy-fueled monologues, had given her the next name on her list, a man named Harrison Bellwether. He was older, a respected judge in a wealthy, established city, known for its old money and rigid social hierarchies. Judge Bellwether was a lion of the community, a pillar of morality, a man whose public pronouncements on justice and virtue were quoted in the newspapers. He was also, as Ilara knew from Finch's ramblings, one of Silas Croft's oldest and most powerful allies, the legal architect who had drafted the very contracts that had ruined her father. He was the man who had given Croft's theft the veneer of legality. To the world, he was a symbol of order and law. To Ilara, he was a whited sepulchre, beautiful on the outside but full of decay and corruption within. Taking him down would be far more difficult and dangerous than dispatching a simple farmer or a vain businessman. This would require an entirely new level of artistry and deception. Ilara traveled to the judge's city, not as a widow this time, but as a mysterious and cultured woman of means from Europe, a Madame de la Roche, a name that hinted at French aristocracy and old-world elegance. She rented a fashionable townhouse, hired a small staff, and began to carefully weave herself into the city's upper crust. She understood that in this world, direct assault was impossible. The judge was protected by layers of wealth, reputation, and social power. She couldn't just marry him and poison his brandy. He was a widower, true, but a man of his station didn't simply marry an unknown newcomer. She had to become indispensable. She had to become part of his world, not as a potential wife, but as something far more intimate, a confidant. She began by making a name for herself in the city's philanthropic circles, a common pastime for wealthy, unattached women. She donated generously to the arts and to the church, making sure her donations were both significant and publicly acknowledged. She hosted small, exclusive salons in her home, inviting poets, artists, and intellectuals. Her gatherings became the talk of the town, known for their stimulating conversation and a hostess who was as intelligent as she was enigmatic. She cultivated an air of sophisticated melancholy, hinting at a tragic past in Europe without ever giving concrete details. People were fascinated. In a society that was often stiflingly dull and predictable, Madame de la Roche was a breath of fresh, mysterious air. It wasn't long before she was invited to the same galas and charity balls as Judge Bellwether. Their first several meetings were brief and formal. She was deferential, showing him the respect his position commanded, but she also engaged him in conversations that went beyond simple pleasantries. She spoke of philosophy, of Roman law, of the nature of justice, topics that stimulated his intellectual vanity. He was intrigued. He, like Arthur Finch, saw in her a reflection of what he wanted to be: worldly, cultured, and profound. He began to seek out her company, finding her a refreshing change from the sycophantic politicians and gossiping matriarchs who usually surrounded it. Elara knew the judge's weakness was not lust or greed, but pride. An immense, unshakable pride in his own intellect and moral rectitude. He truly believed he was a good man, that his actions were always for the greater good, even if they sometimes required unpleasant legal maneuvering. He had long ago compartmentalized his work for men like Croft as a necessary part of a functioning capitalist society. Elara's strategy was not to seduce him, but to become his intellectual equal, the one person he could speak to who truly understood. She became his confessor, not of sins, but of intellectual frustrations. He would complain to her about the mediocrity of his colleagues, the short-sightedness of politicians. She would listen, her head tilted at the perfect angle of sympathetic intelligence, offering observations that were both insightful and flattering to his ego. "It must be a heavy burden, Judge," she would say, her voice a soft murmur, "to see the world so clearly when others are content with the shadows." His chest would swell with self-importance. He began to visit her townhouse regularly, first for tea, then for private dinners. The city's gossips were in a frenzy. What were the intentions of the esteemed judge and the mysterious French widow? But their relationship was so platonic on the surface, so cerebral, that it defied easy categorization. He was not courting her, he was communing with her. He was also a man in his late 60s, with a host of minor but persistent health problems, chief among them a weak heart that occasionally gave him spells of shortness of breath and palpitations. The family doctor had prescribed digitalis, a common heart remedy derived from the foxglove plant. It was a potent medication. A few drops a day strengthened the heart's contractions. A little too much, however, could be fatal, and its symptoms, nausea, confusion, and a dangerously slow or erratic heartbeat, could easily be mistaken for a natural cardiac event in an elderly man with a known heart condition. Elara, as their friendship deepened, took on the role of a concerned, devoted friend. She would learn about his medication, his diet, his routines, all under the guise of caring for his well-being. "You must allow me to help, Harrison," she would insist, using his first name only in the privacy of her home. "You carry the weight of the world on your shoulders. The least I can do is ensure you are taking proper care of yourself." He was touched by her devotion. He had grown children, but they were busy with their own lives and families, their visits often feeling more like a duty than a pleasure. Elara's concern felt genuine, pure. He began to rely on her, entrusting her with more and more of his personal life. He even gave her a key to his house, so she could check on him if he was ever feeling unwell. It was a fatal mistake. He had willingly invited the fox into the henhouse. The process was even slower and more meticulous than it had been with Arthur Finch. It had to be perfect. She couldn't be present when he died. She couldn't be the one to find the body. The suspicion would be too great. Her weapon was his own medicine. During her visits, when she would pour him a glass of water or a cup of tea, she would, on occasion, add a single, extra drop of digitalis to his daily dose, which he kept in a decanter on his sideboard. Just one drop. It was imperceptible. Over weeks, the poison began to accumulate in his system. He started complaining of worsening symptoms. He felt nauseous more often. His vision was sometimes blurred, and his heart palpitations became more frequent and alarming. His doctor was called, examined him, and, seeing an elderly man with a worsening heart condition, did the logical thing. He increased the prescription. He was, unwittingly, helping Elara commit the perfect murder. Elara played her part with masterful precision. She would listen to his complaints with a face etched with worry. She would read medical texts, discussing his symptoms with him with an air of intellectual curiosity, all while knowing their precise cause. She was his most trusted friend, his Florence Nightingale, his angel of mercy. The irony was so thick, so potent. It was almost a physical presence in the room with them. She was slowly, methodically, lovingly, murdering him with his own prescription, and he adored her for her care. What do you think is more chilling? The swift, violent act of a killer, or the slow, patient, intimate betrayal of a friend who smiles in your face while meticulously planning your demise? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. It's a question that sits at the very heart of Ilara's darkness. The end for Judge Harrison Bellwether came on a Sunday. Ilara had spent the afternoon with him, reading poetry aloud as he rested on his sofa. She noted his labored breathing, the gray pallor of his skin. She knew the time was near. That morning, she had added 3 extra drops to his decanter. She left his home in the early evening, making sure several of his neighbors saw her leave. She told him she was attending a concert, creating an ironclad alibi. "Rest well, Harrison," she had said, adjusting the blanket over him. "I will see you tomorrow." He smiled weakly, his eyes full of gratitude and affection. "You are a true friend, Ilara," he whispered. They were his last words to her. He was found the next morning by his housekeeper, dead in his bed. The official cause of death was heart failure. It was a tragedy. The city mourned, but no one was surprised. He was an old man with a bad heart. It was his time. His children arrived draped in black, and were profoundly grateful to the mysterious Madame de la Roche, the woman who had been a comfort to their father in his final months. They had no idea she was the author of his end. At the reading of the will, there was a collective gasp. Judge Bellwether, a man of sound mind and esteemed judgment, had added a recent codicil. In it, he bequeathed a staggering sum of money and a portfolio of valuable stocks to his dearest friend and intellectual companion, Ilara de la Roche, in gratitude for her unwavering devotion and the great light she brought to his twilight years. Ilara accepted the inheritance with a quiet, solemn grace that bordered on saintly. She had done it. She had outwitted one of the sharpest legal minds in the country. She had turned his own pride and his own medicine against him. She had stripped him of his life and diverted a significant portion of his wealth built on the crushed dreams of people like her father. And she had done it all while being hailed as a loyal, loving friend. Judge Bellwether's name was crossed off the list. Her war chest was now immense. Her skill was honed to a razor's edge. She was no longer just an avenger. She was an artist, and murder was her medium. She stayed in the city for a few more months, cementing her reputation as the grieving friend, before announcing that the memories were too painful and she would be returning to Europe. She vanished once more, the elegant Madame de la Roche dissolving into mist, just as Mrs. Miller and Mrs. Finch had before. Somewhere, in a quiet room in a new city, Ilara Thorne took out her list. There were still names on it, and the most important one, the one at the very top, was Silas Croft. The final act was about to begin. She was no longer hunting his lieutenants. She was coming for the king,